So we've established that the Cullens do not care about Bella because they do not care about humans. The Twilight vampires by nature do not care about humans. The Cullens just cosplay and pretend to care about humans, but their actions are ultimately self-serving and destructive towards them. So do the Cullens care about each other? This is such an interesting topic, and I would say yes, they do, but it's complex and they don't all care about each other the same way, and ultimately their relationships are self-serving as well. So in general, vampires definitely value other vampires above humans, which they don't value at all, and they are able to form specific bonds with other vampires. Large covens like the Cullens are actually very rare, and it is the most common for vampires to exist and travel solitarily or with one other person, a mate. And mates are another important aspect of this topic, which I will get to. But when vampires do form bonds, it's generally not based on love of any kind, but also to aid their selfish drives. And that's not my theorization, that's actually canon. Stephanie actually talks about this in the guide. It's most common for vampires not to form a bond outside of a mate bond because their driving force and the most important thing to them is bloodlust, and they're very selfish and competitive. Larger covens are usually torn apart by internal violence. What will allow vampires to bond and cause them to bond is ambition, because it makes their lives easier to be a unified force for the mutual benefit of those vampires, and that can allow them to bond, and that can keep a larger coven more stable. The first vampires to do this successfully were the Romanian coven, and of course they used to be a much larger coven than just Vladimir and Stefan. The third possible bonding factor, and the one we are to believe applies to the Cullens, is in reference to this detail that drinking animal blood, so the vegetarian diet, not feeding on humans, allows vampires to form stronger bonds with each other. And through this, over time, they can form closer, more caring relationships with vampires other than their mates and have a more family-style union. Interestingly, though, I think it's clear that this doesn't necessarily make them care more about the humans themselves. They're still inherently selfish, just theoretically more than the vampires who don't ever question the drive for bloodlust. And the Cullens, of course, are their own special brand. Still, though, the most important person to a vampire other than themselves is generally going to be their mate, and the Cullens are kind of a demonstration of that, but they're weird. And to clarify, mates in Twilight, by the way, are not a defined concept in the way that imprinting or singers are. Twilight vampires do not have predetermined mates. It's not something where you lock eyes with a specific person and it happens. They can fall in love with anybody. It's just that the idea is once they develop these feelings and decide somebody is their mate, it's supposed to be unchanging. And these feelings are constant and strong, and vampires are characteristically very vengeful about their mates. But interestingly, it's important to note that the mate bond is not always reciprocal. It's not clearly defined, and there are definitely levels to these bonds. Example, Riley considered Victoria to be his mate. Victoria never really cared about Riley at all. She considered James to be her mate. And James liked Victoria a lot, but he never cared about her as much as she cared about him. So as far as the Cullens, I think we do have examples here of the standard. They primarily care about themselves and their mates. The rest is much less important, but they're interesting because a few of them seem to prioritize Edward, like Carlisle. I believe he cares about his family in a broad sense as the creepy human cosplay cult he created in his own image playing Sims, and I do believe he would be genuinely sad and grieved to lose any one of them. But who would he put before any of the others? Edward. Honestly, I genuinely believe Carlisle cares about Edward the most. Edward, that's his true pride. And what is fascinating is that Esme really only cares about and prioritizes Carlisle and Edward. And I go back and forth with who she cares about more, because it genuinely does seem to me that Esme cares about Edward the most, but that genuinely could be because Esme simply does what Carlisle does and what Carlisle wants and what makes Carlisle happy. With virtually no exceptions, and Carlisle loves Edward the most and prioritizes Edward. So could that be, at least in part, another facet of Esme dutifully and blindly following Carlisle's lead? Yes, I think that's quite possible. But the interesting thing about Esme is that everybody does generally seem to want to please her, and I would say most of them would put Esme after their mates in terms of like who they care about and want to please, but particularly the men, like definitely more so the men. Esme's pull or charm or gift seems to be more effective on men. Fascinating. Alice and Jasper the Confederate have both gone on record essentially saying that they would F over the whole family in favor of each other. But the thing about Alice is she's sneaky, and I do think she's a liar and a schemer. Like, Alice for sure loves the family dynamic and what each person brings to that. But again, Alice seems to like and care about Edward the most. I genuinely believe, at the very least, Alice likes Edward and enjoys spending time with him more than Jasper and any of the other Cullens. Jasper the Confederate is primarily there with the Cullens for his manic pixie dream snake, and he's not really even quiet about that. Rosalie is interesting because she also likes the family dynamic, but I think in a different way than Alice does. She wants to be as human as possible. She wants to feel like a human, and like I've said, I believe that's her primary reasoning for never tasting human blood, and being with the Cullens gives her some semblance of that, of having a family and being human. And I believe that contributes to Rosalie caring about that, and that's why she tolerates someone like Edward as her brother, who she clearly doesn't like very much as a person, because she likes the family setup. She obviously, though, cares about Emmett the most, and Emmett also likes the family, and I believe he genuinely likes all of them, and he would be genuinely sad to lose any one of them. Even Bella, honestly. Would he, though, turn on any one of them if required for Rosalie's sake? Yes, and we know this. Edward idolizes Carlisle and wants to please and protect and shield Esme the most. I think he cares about them the most, and then after that he definitely likes and cares about Alice best. I think he cares about the family as a whole, but he doesn't care about them enough not to pursue his selfish desires at their expense. And then of course Bella becomes the priority project rather, but ultimately I believe Edward, much like Carlisle, values his own self-righteousness and proving it more than anything else. So I do believe these vampires can care about other vampires, and I believe the Cullens do, but it's different. It's their version of caring, and they're ultimately self-serving creatures. And when these vampires choose to pursue humans, I think every example we're shown demonstrates that it is always about power, manipulation, something they can gain. They are clearly not looking for an equal, and I don't think Bella and Edward are any exception. And I will talk about that too.